As many of you are no doubt aware, the BioShock games have been very highly praised in the field of games criticism, primarily for their writing. Both the original and Infinite have been described as the thinking man's shooter, lauded for the depth and intelligence and of course the crucial maturity of their stories and world building, and this just isn't accurate, I feel. I'm sure many of you have already seen Matthew Matos's excellent critique of BioShock Infinite, which covers the problems with that game's writing far better than I could, and the latest entry in the franchise seems to have lost a lot of its sterling reputation over the years anyway, but from what I can tell, the original seems to have still retained a lot of the fame and adoration it accrued back at release, and having recently taken it for a spin myself, I feel the need to outline why I think all this praise is largely undeserved. BioShock styles itself as both a spiritual successor to games like System Shock 2 and Deus Ex, as well as a criticism of Randian objectivist philosophy, and I think that it fails utterly in both these pursuits. Firstly, as any sort of follow-up or successor to the classic first-person simulationist RPGs, I find the game to be lackluster at best, and I say this as someone who's not even particularly fond of System Shock 2 or Deus Ex. These are titles which are most widely known for the depth and complexity of their systems, an area in which BioShock is conspicuously and sorely lacking. The most obvious issues are the extremely confining nature of the character progression on offer, limited to minor upgrades to various functionalities which are all completely functional to begin with anyway. There's no way to focus a build on certain capabilities at the expense of others. You start the game totally fine at everything and can only improve yourself from there in little ways, and you do this primarily by putting passive buff items into a very limited number of slots. This in itself completely unbalances what could have been an at least mildly interesting system of allowing the player to choose whether to approach combat using gunplay, hacking security systems, or plasmids, this game's equivalent to a magic system. Instead of being faced with interesting decisions about the best way to handle a particular challenge, the answer is always to simply use all of these options as much as possible. If you see a turret, you should hack it. There is never any reason not to. And on your way toward it, you should zap it with the electricity plasmid to stun it. The cost is absolutely negligible, and it keeps you from getting perforated while trying to reach it. If you run across an enemy, you should take a picture of them. It'll make them go down easier in the future, and doing so is instantaneous and immediately pauses the game, allowing you to instantly switch to another weapon when you're done with minimal risk of being caught in a bad position. There simply isn't any form of risk and reward at play here. The answer to should I try to do this thing is always yes, because the game just doesn't punish you in any meaningful way if you do it and fuck up. This even extends to the loot system, which is so vestigial that it may as well not even be there. Most items that you pick up will be automatically used on acquisition, and all the items that you do actually hold on to, like first aid kits, EVE hypos, and ammunition, each just have their own individual inventory caps. There's no inventory management of any kind. In fact, you don't even have an inventory screen, which makes the fact that you have to actively loot corpses and choose to pick up items that will never have any penalty aside from bringing you closer to the maximum amount of that item that you can hold feel like pointless busywork. There isn't even a way to selectively loot certain items out of corpses. All you have is a take all button, because there's never any reason not to. The result of all this is that the gameplay, while completely functional, is very unengaging because you don't really need to pay much attention to anything. All the interesting mechanics you'd have in an actual shooter or an RPG have been boiled down to a thin gray paste where you run down corridors, shoot mutants, and grab everything before moving on to the next room to do it all over again. The game's pathological refusal to ever give you a choice where both options are tempting even extends to the attempted morality system. When you defeat one of the iconic Big Daddies, you have the option to either kill the little sister he was guarding, getting a bunch of Atom out of it, which can be used to purchase upgrades, or you can turn her back into a regular girl, which will still give you quite a bit of Atom, just not as much as if you had killed her, and also for every few little sisters that you save, you'll get a reward in the form of more Atom and some free upgrades. So it's a choice between a reward now or a much bigger and better reward if you wait about half an hour. There is simply no narrative or mechanical reason to ever choose the evil option in this game, and it renders the whole thing meaningless. And these are the least of the narrative's problems. As I mentioned earlier, the game fancies itself a criticism of Randian objectivism, and the way it attempts this is through the character Andrew Ryan, the founder of Rapture. The problem is that Ryan is not actually an objectivist. Sure, he's way up on that laissez-faire capitalism and other egoist policies, and he certainly brings across Rand's writing style in his monologues, but he misses the core of the philosophy, and as a result, he comes across as less of a criticism and more of a misunderstanding. For those unfamiliar, Ayn Rand's philosophy of objectivism was built around the idea that the world can and should be understood through observation and reasoning, and that the best way to interface with said world is rationally. She derived a number of conclusions from this basis, including that pursuing one's own self-interest is a moral imperative, that capitalism is the only functional economic system, and that an increase in economic and political freedom will correlate to an increase in the general wealth and prosperity for all living in a nation. While a full criticism of Rand's philosophy is well outside the scope of this video, I don't think it would be inappropriate for me to note that some of these conclusions, as well as some not mentioned here, were not based so much on rational thought as Rand would like to believe, and were more a reaction to her experiences with communism in her home country of Russia. A bias, if you will. My purpose in pointing this out is to establish that there is a totally practical way to criticize objectivism in a meaningful way without even having to get into more niche postmodern concepts like the subjective nature of human experience. Simply acknowledging that a lot of the capitalist and egoist aspects of the philosophy are not necessarily as in line with the ideals of rationalism and freedom of speech at its core is enough. But BioShock doesn't even go this far. Indeed, it fails to convince me that anyone writing it has more than a passing familiarity with Rand's ideas. At no point is Andrew Ryan shown to have any fundamental principles on which his policies are based. He seems to view minimalist economic legislature as a moral imperative in and of itself, and worse yet, he is shown very early on to have eventually instituted policies of corporal punishment against people attempting to bring ideological material from the surface into Rapture. In fact, a fairly small chunk of Rapture's issues can be attributed to Ryan's economic policies when compared with the absolute hell wreaked by his social policies, none of which have anything to do with objectivism. It's just weak writing. Ryan embodies the most recognizable and widely hated aspects of Rand's philosophy while utterly discarding any aspect that might make it even slightly difficult to criticize, and as a result he reads like a lazily written despot with no redeeming value to his character, and nothing of value to say about the philosophy he was very clearly written to lampoon. Not only is this disappointing because it undercuts what could generously be called the primary theme of the game's story, it also robs the character of what could have been some genuine likability and nuance had he been portrayed as an idealistic and freedom-oriented but ultimately naive and tragic figure, as opposed to the self-centered, immature, and frankly cartoonish capitalist fat cat you'll discover in the game's audio logs. In the end, the only aspects of BioShock I can say are worth the time put into them are a few of the secondary characters who can be quite interesting in their particular psychoses, and the aesthetic of Rapture, which is a really beautiful piece of Art Deco architecture, even if it is trapped on the god-awful Unreal 3 engine. Incidentally, whose decision was it to set an Unreal 3 game underwater? Isn't it common knowledge that this engine is terrible at fluid effects? Anyway, the story projects a veneer of maturity and thoughtfulness through its theming and tone, but is ultimately not particularly well thought out or thought-provoking, and the gameplay would require a complete overhaul to be in any way interesting. This isn't so much the thinking man's shooter as it is a shooter that might trick an idle brain into believing that it's thinking.